is from the University of Birmingham, and she came to us to develop a project which looks at, in a way, I suppose it's climate justice. What we're looking at is how we, particularly in the east of the borough, look at how climate change impacts on the most vulnerable people and what has got to be done specifically in those areas in order to adapt to what's going to happen because of climate change. And she's put in a bid jointly with us to get some funding to be able to develop that. And what I'm going to do now is talk to Ali and talk about the project so that you can understand it more and we can all understand it more. So, Hallie, thanks for joining us, and we've got a 10 minutes section on this as well. Tell us then, you've put this project in with us about adaptation taking place in specific localities because different localities will have different problems. Some will have overcrowding in heat islands, some will have flooding, and so on and so on. How important is it that we look at specific localities, place-based approach, in other words? How important is that in addressing climate change?
So yeah, it's quite important. Um, um, I came to Encaf with this proposal based on work that we're doing in Birmingham in the West Midlands on a project called WM Adapt, which stands for West Midlands Adapt. But I'm a resident in Enfield, so I wanted to see if I could bring what we're doing in the West Midlands area home, if you will. And our departure point is that there's, a significant amount of evidence, including from the recent independent report called Progress in Adapting to Climate Change, published this year by the Climate Change Committee, that says UK cities are not climate ready and that people who are already feeling the worst effects are in fact the worst off. So in other words, the people who are most vulnerable to things like extreme heat and extreme cold and heavy rain and storms and damp are also the most vulnerable. So those who are living in poverty, the elderly, especially elderly people living on their own, homeless people, children, people with chronic health issues, pregnant and menopausal women. And so far, despite a lot of talk and investment, things don't seem to be getting any better, in my view, because approaches are very generic and top-down. They're oriented towards generating profit or growth. So focusing on technology-centered approaches or programs like net zero that can tend to be one-size-fits-all aren't really working. And we're arguing that any effective adaptation has to be place-based. And that means aware of the full range of vulnerabilities faced by residents and how these different vulnerabilities overlap and compound and intersect with each other, but how they also play out in the wider context of specific neighborhoods, bearing in mind their physical characteristics and their resource constraints.
What we're trying to do, aren't we, is go into three particular wards and try and find what their specific issues are. And we're trying to create a dialogue with people in those wards using what is called a World Cafe approach. And that's something Locomotion is very interested in because they want to do that nationally. Can you explain to people what we mean by a World Cafe approach?
Sure, I'll explain and I'll try to give examples too. So World Cafe is a globally tried and tested participatory method that's been taken up in the research community as well. In academia, I wouldn't say it's an academic tool, it's more of a deliberatory tool. But it works really well in doing research with and for communities. And it takes place in an informal cafe-like setting where discussion is facilitated around specifically framed topics. And the ethos is one of respectful sharing and listening, sometimes storytelling. So bringing people together to get to know each other and their experiences and their views, and also to try and understand where those views come from. And there are different ways of doing World Cafes. So you can have kind of static conversation where you would ideally be working with a group that is no bigger than 20 or 25 people, although I've I've seen it done in much larger groups. I don't know that it works that well in larger groups, but you would have maybe 25 people divided into smaller groups of 4 or 5, and they might be given a question. For example, in WM Adapt, the first question is to ask people to share their experience of extreme weather and how it's impacted them on a personal level as well as across their neighborhood. And so there'll be discussions for a set period of time, like not too long, especially for this question, talking about experiences with extreme weather has to be framed carefully again because we're trying to avoid the whole sort of stoking of anxiety and triggering people. But the idea is to identify the challenges that people are facing on a daily basis, and then feeding that back to the whole room. But then you can also have more dynamic settings where people will have a topic per table and will move around the room, visiting different tables and sharing and explaining their views and feeding those back to the room.
And the outcome of this is obviously some academic research that University of Birmingham is very interested in. But from our point of view, also the development of a how-to manual so that we can take it to other areas to see how they can look at their needs. Could you explain how you think we could do that?
Yeah, so we're in the process of converting the methods that we have designed in Birmingham into a kind of manual or handbook for community engagement so that people can have these discussions in their own neighborhoods, being a place-based project. And so this resource is being co-produced. So we're learning as we go from our own reflections as engaged scholars, but also with the community researchers that we recruit and train, that we work with to co-facilitate, and also learning from the feedback from the participants themselves. And I think this is really important because SDG 11 is laudable in some ways, the way it calls for making cities more inclusive and safe and resilient and sustainable. But apart from that, as a goal, it's really quite hollow, and it's underpinned by a lot of assumptions about how to achieve this. And for us, climate adaptation isn't really just a technical or a financial issue. It's actually about justice and human rights and inclusivity. So yeah, that's how we're designing this manual.
We have another project we're talking about. We don't know whether we'll get the funding for any of this, by the way. We hope we will. But we have another project, don't we, that's attached to this in a way. It's a subsidiary to this, where we hope as a result of working with another board and the work we've done on this project, we can develop what's called a vulnerability index to find out who are the most vulnerable in the area and who will be affected by extreme weather, like heat excess, for example. Paris has got that after they had the huge crisis in 2003. We don't have that as systematically as they do. And is that your hope that we can develop that sort of vulnerability index?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the proposal is developing something called a climate risk and vulnerability assessment at ward level for the most deprived or underserved wards of Enfield. And you can see an example of this if you go to the West Midlands Combined Authority website. But this combines different layers of data already in the public realm on different types of vulnerability, including climatic, so risk of heat island effect, river and surface flooding, environmental data like risk from lack of tree canopy cover and open green space, but also combined socioeconomic vulnerability, so data on poverty, unemployment, education level, linguistic isolation, elderly people living alone, and percent of income spent on housing. And it's similar, it would probably come out looking like the index of multiple deprivation. You'd get a color-coded ranking that shows where the greatest vulnerabilities are. I'm not sure how possible it is to produce a more granular picture at ward level, but it's certainly something we can explore. And the value in doing this is, of course, so that authorities can see where the biggest problems are and where money needs to go. But the real value of the CRVA is in combining it, I think, with the World Cafe data to show what residents' priorities are, especially the most vulnerable.
And you say to show, and that's why I think you want to make sure we can involve the statutory authorities, like we are in the school project. We have the climate change officer in Enfield involved. You're hoping that in this project we can get the statutory authorities, health, local authority, and so on involved. And you have this idea that we might do something like a town hall meeting and maybe develop a permanent local resilience forum that continuously looks at these problems. Is that one of your aims?
Absolutely. So to bring the local authorities together with the science and show them what we found and have a really constructive dialogue that isn't about blaming or finger pointing, but just dealing with the crisis at hand in ways that are realistic in terms of available resources, but also allows for creativity based on institutional innovations, coordinating better what's already out there, not focusing on technological and innovation so much, but maybe new ways of governing adaptation, again, more based on community needs.